What were the circumstances? He didn't prove what he was supposed to prove. He took advantage of them. Money. What was
Well, this is where the story gets very complicated. Galileo had been brought before the Inquisition earlier on, around 1616, and he was sort of not directly accused of being heretical, but there was a whole controversy that arose because of conflicts between the Jesuits and the Dominicans, the Aristotelian scholars. Galileo was a rebel, and his thoughts were very radical, and this tends to be destabilizing. So he ended up alienating many factions and in fact, at the end, he got everybody upset with him, which is probably why he ended up, as we say, brought on his own problems. But he initially had support of the Jesuits, but he had offended the Dominicans greatly. And in terms of, I lost the question, sorry.
Okay, I was just asking.
Oh, how did he, sorry, say again.
How did he wind up in house arrest? What had he done wrong specifically? Had he taken money from them to prove something? What happened to lead to the house arrest?
Okay. Galileo's house arrest was the culmination of a series, really actually over a period from 1616 to 1633. And it's not just one incident, it's a series of incidents, but in the period of roughly around 1613 to 1616, Galileo was drawn into the Copernican argument. He had tended to keep his opinions to himself or limited to sort of private correspondences, but his whole approach, his arrogance and his alienation of many other authoritarian constituencies, the Jesuits, the Dominicans, the scholars, he was inadvertently pulled into the Copernican controversy. And once he was in, he could never get back out. And what happened was he actually signed a consent decree in 1616 that said he would no longer hold, teach, or defend Copernican theory, but the sidebar was, you can study it all you want, just don't hold it out as being the truth. And so there's a whole intrigue whether he signed what was called an injunction, the injunction of 1616, whether what he signed got changed by the church, whether he never signed it, but ultimately he ended up having two documents that conflicted in the middle of the trial. So it's a little bit of a whole cat and mouse. It's like an Agatha Christie mystery story, how all this happened. And this is part of why it's such a complicated story. But by 1633, in the midst of all of the other considerations, the church discovered he had signed this injunction. And what he was really being put on trial for was violating the injunction. So it really wasn't a conflict between the science and the religion. It was, he had exhibited some bad behavior, at least in the view of the church, and certainly in view of his former dear friend, the Pope. And so what gets cast as a conflict between science and religion may not have been the direct issue at hand, but having to do with really Galileo's behavior unto itself.
Are you getting those people?
Not really, but it would be good to...
Do we know? Okay. I just want to go back to the telescope for a second. Galileo was blind?
Well, he went blind later on in his life. He died blind. Not exactly clear. It's viewed he may have contracted an infection in one eye that over time went to the other eye. But one of the ironies and the poignancies of the whole story is this is a man who saw more than anyone and ultimately ended up blind. And there's an interesting sidebar, part of one of the more intriguing elements to me that really people have not focused on, or I haven't been able to find anything that really elaborates, but he was visited by John Milton, the English poet, the English essayist, who wrote some great sonnets, who wrote Paradise Lost and Paradise Found. and Milton also ended up going blind. So there's this kind of irony about these two, what happened at the meeting between John Milton and Galileo, which we think took place only because in a famous essay, in fact, something known as Areopagitica, an essay written by John Milton, he talks about visiting the blind scientist who was unjustly treated by the Inquisition. And so I'm fascinated with that whole relationship of what happened at that meeting or series of meetings between John Milton and Galileo.
So as you started to read more about this and become obsessed, or it led you into all these different areas, did you start thinking of Galileo as a rock star scientist?
Well, that was kind of I'd say, the Dean Kamen encounter when he said, why don't we treat our scientists like rock stars? Then started, perhaps subliminally in the back of my mind, saying, this is really the world's first rock star. And so it was kind of from two different directions, the fact that he was a rogue, that he refused to write in Latin, he would only write in the vernacular in contemporary Italian, which started really with Dante and the Inferno. So all of the academics and the church always wrote and spoke in Latin because that was the universal language, but Galileo refused to do so. So he was a popularizer. His lectures when he was a professor were sellout lectures. So and he became literally the most famous man in the world, according to some people. There's a whole separate side, which we can talk about later, but he really became a rogue, who the equivalent of going, a president who insisted upon wearing jeans when addressing the Congress would be the best way to think about it.
Really?
So he refused to wear the robes that the professors typically wore. So he really was a rebel. And so that roguish rebel side of his personality, his arrogance, he had a wicked tongue, a sharp tongue, which in part caused his own problems. But they used to argue what was called ad hominem. Ad hominem is when you attack the man, not the argument. So that was just the style of the day. So he would take his opponents and give them a verbal lashing, and he was so articulate, sort of a Voltaire of of his day, and would humiliate people. And so that incurred a lot of resentment. But hence, it felt like a rock star to me.
So was he loved and hated? Was Galileo like either you loved him or you hated him?
I'd say he evoked strong reaction. He was either loved or hated, but ultimately became viewed as dangerous, and that's a very complicated part of the story, but it also adds to it.
I want to segue into the music. How did you get an idea to write something about this? Did you start with a song? Did you start with, how did this come about?
I'd started writing some music in the very early 90s, working with someone who had been my guitar teacher, Alan Schwartz. I've been taking guitar lessons. I've been playing since, I guess I got my first guitar when I was 12 years old. And it was always just part of my life, but I was never, I played in a couple of bands that never seemed to go out and perform. I think if I received $20 for performing the handful of times, that would be about it. I did perform with my band at my bar mitzvah, in my high school when I was in 6th grade, but I was never going to be a performing musician. I was endowed with a bad sense of timing and stage fright, which is not a good combination for someone who wants to be a musician. Having said that, the great thing about music, and particularly rock and roll, is there are other aspects. And I did find I had, with a lot of encouragement from Alan, a little bit of a talent for writing music. And it started, I guess, my music writing, you have to put it in a little bit of context. My music writing really began after I discovered, a year or so into taking my guitar lessons, something known as open G tuning, which never having studied and not having really progressed to become a serious musician, I had always known standard E tuning and the open E tuning, but was just never came across open G tuning. And
You'd listen to the Rolling Stones.
I didn't know it was, well, I did listen to the Rolling Stones, and you can imagine my frustration. I always played by ear, and in all of my years, could never figure out how to play Honky Tonk Woman. And so in one of my earliest lessons with Alan, I said, he said, give me the top 10 songs you want to play. What are your objectives? And so I listed, and the first song is, I always wanted to be able to play Honky Tonk Woman.
What were some of the other ones you wanted to play?
Oh gosh, I will leave out the unspoken. I wanted to play Stairway to Heaven properly. This was before I understood if you ever go to 48th Street and start playing Stairway to Heaven in a music store, they throw water balloons at you. But you know, you want to play Stairway to Heaven properly, and that means exactly. You want to play Roundabout by Yes. Another one of the songs was Hole in My Heart by Extreme, and which did lead to, and this is, you know, and there was some Santana songs, Oye Como Va, you know, so I had a list of 10. I still have it somewhere at home, but it was that moment with Alan, and what he would say, he said, okay, play the song for me. So I did my version of Honky Tonk Woman, and he kind of shook his head. He says, don't you know, man? You're playing it in the wrong tuning. So I said, oh, what's the right tuning? And Alan explained to me open G tuning. And all of a sudden, you know, it was like, you know, having been in the desert for 30 years trying to play this one song the wrong way, that a whole new thing opened, and I started playing probably for 4 or 5 years exclusively in open G tuning.
I want to go back a bit to your playing.
So
What?
a piece of tape is
Oh.
now actually, it wasn't in the shop, but if I go wider, so
Okay.
we'll just do that. I don't think it's worth the risk of the tape. Thank you. Go ahead.
What music did you listen to as a kid?
I was always a huge Beatles fan, and I was a Rolling Stones fan, but not quite as big until sort of later with sort of the Sticky Fingers period. You know, in my earliest days, obviously the you know, 19th Nervous Breakdown, Satisfaction, but it was part of the culture for me. It was part of, you know, growing up. Huge Led Zeppelin fan, huge Jethro Tull fan, became a huge Yes fan. And so sort of that, the earliest days, I guess you'd have to go with, you know, Paul Revere and the Raiders. Beach Boys wasn't my thing. I always appreciated them, but it was a little too squealy for me with the falsetto. But it was really, you know, the great, you know, late 60s and early 70s, Iron Butterfly, and of course, you know, everybody had to do In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida, The Doors. And so you know, just it became such an important part of my my existence, was growing up with the music.
So basically, it was classic rock influences, yes?
Yes.
And when you played with your band, was it covers, or did you ever write songs?
No original music growing up. It was really more of a, everybody was in a garage band, and you know, you'd change like every, you know, once a month, someone would get thrown out of the band, or the band would break up. I went to a military school, and we're talking in the 70s, so I had short hair where all the cool guys, you know, had their long hair. So it was a very interesting period, but it always stayed with me. Such an important part of my my childhood.
What was the first guitar?
First guitar, well, the first guitar I got was, I was 12 years old, and my father owned the local toy stores. And I got for Christmas a plastic Emily guitar, plastic. And that was my first guitar. And of course, you only play on the E string and the B string. Of course, I didn't even know what the names of the strings were. And then somehow the guitar broke. I mean, it's plastic, so it didn't take much. I then somehow convinced my father he should carry electric guitars at the toy store. So he ordered 2. I took one, and of course, the one I got had a broken neck. So for, I guess, the first 6 months to a year I was playing it, I don't even know if it had a name. It was just sort of a cheap Japanese kind of remember it was sort of like a reddish, almost red sunburst